Alright, hey y'all. So I guess jump right into this. The second part here to Seduction. Let's see if we can get through it all today, but maybe not, looking at what we have. So I left off the last time talking about the story at Samarkand, and that leads into what would be around the halfway point of the book, and the subsequent chapter titled The Secret and the Challenge. So these are two terms that are pretty important in Baudrillard's work, although at no point does he really allocate them a certain definition. Rather, they're just things that float around throughout his work, especially the stuff that follows this. There is a little bit of a brief move away from that with simulacra and simulation and in the shadow of the silent majorities, but it picks back up again a lot, especially in fatal strategies and going on from there. So the secret for him is, he begins the chapter with just the sentence, "the secret," whatever that means. But he goes on to say that the seductive, initiatory quality of that which cannot be said because it makes no sense, and of that which is not said even though it gets around. Thus I know another secret, but do not reveal it, and he knows what I know, but does not acknowledge it. The intensity between us is simply this secret about the secret. So one of the elements about the secret that Baudrillard finds so interesting is that it maintains something of mystery. So this is really an important quality. So what we've been seeing so far in Baudrillard's work is his identification of these oppressive models of understanding, right? So in what way does, for instance, looking back to symbolic exchange and death, does Freud give us a narrative about something that should really be left hidden? What is that noise? Oh, it'll go away. Something that should really be left hidden. So the secret for Baudrillard is really something to celebrate, in a sense. But at the same time, and I guess this would be a reason why he doesn't really explore it in detail or give it that kind of face, is that would destabilize its very potential at being something occupying that sort of enigmatic space, or that sort of enigmatic positionality. And then the challenge, serves something of another purpose, but they are intertwined in some way. So, in the original French, there are times when challenge is translated from défier. So, a direct translation could be to defy, to, simply to challenge. But with to defy, there is the implication that there was some success in the act of challenging. Whereas to just challenge something does not imply there having been the consequence necessary, or a certain consequence that was sought after, or there having been any consequence at all. And to challenge in Baudrillard's work, for the most part, he uses that when speaking about, air quotes, primitive societies, and the way in which they engage with something like sacrifice, and how that serves as a way to defy, or a way to challenge the gods. Or in the case of the Aztecs, which is an example he gives often, how there was a certain necessity to feed the sun, but it's not a one-way street. In fact, it operates, chiastically, I think that's right. Chiastically, there is obviously a giving and taking, and that's something that they recognize, where it's not as though the sun just gives without needing the counter gift, a la mouse, but actually you need to replenish the energy of the sun with blood or whatever, and how there is not simply in that mutual understanding. So the role of the challenge is to, in a sense, push the very limits of that which, whatever object we have at hand, or whatever source of energy or power or whatever, be it a god, the sun, sun can be a god, but given any of these examples, it is not simply as though these things occur happily, but that through the act of challenging, these persona, if I can call them that, are driven to perform in some capacity, in some superior capacity to that of the past, to drive them to be better than themselves. So to return to The Secret once again, The Secret is for Baudrillard what stands away from that which is repressed within the the lexical domain of psychoanalysis, or that which is hidden, which can ultimately be found, like say for instance, the Purloined Letter in Edgar Allan Poe's tale there, that Derrida writes about quite eloquently. But in those two instances, there is the possibility of a thing coming into fruition again, of something coming back. Whereas The Secret for Baudrillard is that which maintains its status only by its maintaining that element or that component of its essence. So it would be wrong to think, to assume, or to attach to psychoanalysis a certain negative quality coming from Baudrillard's theory of seduction here, because I don't think he's totally prepared to do away with that, right? And this is what he was talking about in Symbolic Exchange and Death very much, is that psychoanalysis, there is the potential for it to maintain the secrecy of the unconscious and to treat it as fundamentally enigmatic and fundamentally ununderstandable. I'm sure there's a better word for that, but it's eluding me. And for Baudrillard, really all it is trying to think of these things in terms of their impossibility as opposed to their possibility. To what extent can we maintain the secret of the unconscious? I guess I can't really say while still trying to map it, because that would be kind of paradoxical. It'd be like trying to, to calculate an atom's, velocity while figuring out its location. Like both can't occur simultaneously. Which leads Baudrillard to say that the unconscious appears as our secret, our personal mystery in a confessional and transparent society, but it isn't really a secret, for it is merely psychological. So this is a thing that we'll return to when we look at the vital illusion, but there's a moment in there when he brings up Heidegger, and something Heidegger says in the question concerning technology, where it appears as though Heidegger is not prepared to totally disavow technology, or to totally just get rid of it. So Baudrillard looks at that moment and he says maybe this new phase, whatever it be, fourth stage simulacra or fourth degree simulacra, hyperreality, what have you, it's just a new game. Any of these things is just a new game with new rules, with new secrets, and it would be naive to suggest that these things can actually go away. So while he's not quite there yet, he's still he still wants to be on the side of critique. There is this moment here, the one that I just read, where the unconscious serves not the goal of the secret, or it does not come to mimic the secret, but that it serves as a sort of cathartic release, or as a compensatory mode of the secret, in the form of this kind of submerged depth to the human psyche. So seduction is then for Baudrillard the act of turning one from one's truth. Now there's a film that I saw recently that captures this particularly well. No film that I've seen so far in my life has demonstrated Baudrillard's theory of seduction as eloquently as this film. Yet, it doesn't ever claim to do that, and there's no indication that the directors had have any knowledge of Baudrillard. Mostly because it's a South Korean film, a South Korean horror film that's on Netflix now. It's called The Wailing. that follows the story of a police officer in a small South Korean town community that is being kind of I will hesitantly call them ghosts. They're kind of being the town is possessed by demons, but this is really showing my epistemological limitations. I don't know what would be the proper way to describe these entities in South Korea, or at least in South Korean myth or spirituality or whatever. But there's a really fascinating moment because one of the people that the police assume to be the culprit at the very end of the film, sorry, spoiler alert, reveals themselves to be the culprit. Yet it is ambiguous as to whether or not they are still the culprit. So they believe wholeheartedly that this person is the devil. At the end of the film, the person transforms themselves into the devil. But the way that it's framed, it shows that this person, I'm not gendering them because I don't want to give it too much away here, that this person is joyfully doing it. That they are becoming the devil not because that is what they are, or a demon or whatever, but that is because that is what is expected of them. So in that sense, they are seduced to become that devil figure, while they simultaneously seduce the, in this case the police, into believing that they are in fact that demon, or that devil. So this plays a very interesting role, especially if we think of seduction, or we think of how seduction can manifest itself in, practical terms, or has implications in real life. Well, for Baudrillard, it's everywhere, but how it can play out in certain physical ways. So this becomes when Baudrillard, or this fits well with when Baudrillard writes that one can seduce someone in order to seduce someone else, but also seduce someone else to please oneself. The illusion that leads from the one to the other is subtle, is to seduce or to be seduced. That is seductive. Is it to seduce or to be seduced that is seductive? So for Baudrillard, the answer would certainly be both, right? There is something very important about the seductive encounter that includes both parties, which is why he goes on to continue in this paragraph that there is no longer a subject nor an object. These things work both ways. There is that element of reversibility, the chiastic relationship, which is important, and is profoundly important to my reading of that film there, in how there is absolutely no clear divide between evil and good, right? And of course, this is rather perplexing given Baudrillard's claim that he's very much a Manichaean, that the good versus evil type thinking. When if we hold his theory of seduction to be wholly true, or we take it at what it presents to us, good and evil would fold into one another, rendering either faceless in a sense. They would then come to occupy the conditions or contain the conditions of the other in this sort of Derridian type deconstructive, possibility, which is, don't open up that can of worms. But anyway, then he takes his time. He goes from seduction, or the secret, into the challenge. So what he has to say about the challenge is that in that moment, when someone is challenging another person, it doesn't necessarily correspond to the logic of, like a sports challenge or whatever. For Baudrillard, it goes as follows. It has a dual form that wears itself out in no time at all, drawing its intensity from this instantaneous reversion. It too is bewitching, like a meaningless discourse to which one cannot respond, for the very reason that it is absurd. Why does one respond to a challenge? The same mysterious question as, what is it that seduces? So the challenge stands in opposition to let's say, provocation. provocation, and this is kind of the way that Bell Hooks frames it in one of her pieces, or one of their pieces, where provocation demands a certain result from the other party, whereas the challenge for Baudrillard cannot predict an end. There's no forecast to be had here. It is rather an opening of possibility, in a sense. Not in the Deleuzian, Guattarian sense, but just the wresting away from someone from their being, in a sense, towards who knows what. There's no way to know, but it does demand a sort of change. So in this way, there is something to be said, or there is a distinction to be drawn between seduction and the challenge. And Baudrillard lays it out as follows. There is a difference. In a challenge, one draws the other into one's area of strength, which, in view of the potential for unlimited escalation, is also his or her area of strength. Whereas in a strategy of seduction, one draws the other into one's area of weakness, which is also his or her area of weakness. So this is important, and neither holds privilege over the other. In fact, we can say that both are going on in the moment, where someone challenges someone else. In that very moment, that person being challenged could very well be seducing the other person to challenge them. And this is how essentially it works. But at the same time, we could frame it as follows, where that form of seduction is in itself a challenge, forcing that person to respond with a challenge, or how that initial action, that initial challenge is in fact, oh my God, is an act of seduction that was intended for, by all intents and purposes, by that person receiving that call for seduction, or that play into seduction, to affirm that seduction, resulting in the initial seduction. I don't like thinking about that. That hurts me. But for Baudrillard, ultimately, to seduce is to appear weak, and then to seduce is to render weak. Desire stands opposed to seduction then. Desire implies that there is something that comes down to the individual as a sole entity that makes up their own mind, that has their own wants, and of course this has a strange affinity, has a strange compliance with, or is rather complicit with, their libidinal drives, which are all things that are, Baudrillard is thrown out the window. Seduction opposes all that precisely because it demands there being some kind of exteriority, a kind of acting upon the body. But it can be anything, really. Like, you can seduce a wall. Like, there is something to be said about how objects seduce in some form or other. But if we are dealing with an individual, I'll use that term loosely, no change is possible without the exertion of some force from the outside, even if that force is in fact not a force, but is a form of seduction that brings that person into something of a weakness. So it's kind of like a counterforce, but still elicits responses nonetheless. So what is then to be said about seduction today? So coming out of thinking about critical theory, or the Frankfurt School or whatever, something like the masses, something like entertainment, the entertainment industry or the culture industry, doesn't serve any sort of mystical or ritualistic role. Rather, they serve, they're simply the opium of the people type thing, they just numb minds, all that kind of stuff. Well, Baudrillard doesn't want to dismiss anything like that. He's kind of Hegelian in that way, I guess, in a sense. Maybe scratch that last part. But he wants to think about these things as being part and parcel of seduction, because seduction for him is immortal. Seduction lives on. Seduction cannot be totally crushed, we hope, at least. So what he states of this is that the ascension of the cinema idols, the masses' divinities, was and remained a central story of modern times. It still counterbalances all political or social events. There is no point in dismissing it as merely the dreams of mystified masses. It is a seductive occurrence that counterbalances every productive occurrence. So productive occurrences belong, again, to that realm of, the kind of productivism to be found in Marx, production of libidinal energies or rendering productive and to potentialize these, sexual drives or whatever. For Baudrillard, the, stars, cinema idols, these kind of ultra real, sign figures serve a ritualistic function in the seductive moment. So he states then, he goes on to continue that, to be sure, seduction in the age of the masses is no longer like that of Les Liaisons Dangereuses, or Dangerous Liaisons, or Diary of the Seducer, for that matter, like that found in ancient mythology, which undoubtedly contained the stories of the richest in seduction. In these, so in those kind of old stories where seduction, before the hyperreal or whatever, seduction is hot, while that of our modern idols is cold, being at the intersection of the two cold mediums, that of the image and that of the masses. So there is something of a regression in seduction, where, like he says, it's somewhere to be found between the image and the masses, where the image would occupy a very, very specific role in the history of seduction. We think back to, Eidolon in the Greek, or the icon or idol, and how Helen of Troy occupied that role as a phantom, as a simulacrum in a sense, and what that, the effects that had in the Battle of Troy, and what role that necessarily served, the idol or the image in that moment. Whereas now with the masses, with the hyperreal, we can hardly say to be existing in the same kind of moment. But Baudrillard wants to think about it in these two different terms. So there being the it's hot seduction and cold seduction, in very many ways, mirroring that McLuhan type hot and cold media, which he might actually, I think he does bring that up somewhere. Right. The great stars or seductresses never dazzle because of their talent or intelligence, but because of their absence. They are dazzling in their nullity and in their coldness, the coldness of makeup and ritual hieraticism. Rituals are cool, according to McLuhan. They turn into a metaphor for, and the word missing, for the immense glacial process which has seized hold of our universe of meaning, with its flickering networks of signs and images, but at the same time at a specific historical conjuncture that can no longer be reproduced. They transform it into an effect of seduction. So there are still these kind of these elements from hot seduction that permeate today, that still are maintained. And think of the interaction between a person and their television or their telephone or whatever. If I was going to really push a Baudrillardian theory to its logical conclusion, I would say that our obsession with cell phones is, in a sense, an act of seduction, where the cell phone is overall indifferent to us. Whoever's holding the cell phone can get the same result from it. The cell phone doesn't care who the user is, yet it seduces us, and in a way we seduce it, because it wouldn't exist without us. Or there's that sort of personification of the cell phone, like, I hurt my phone, or whatever kind of discourse you can get out of that makes the cell phone human, and then can be inscribed with that sort of meaning, can be brought into the seductive moment as it has existed in the past, that kind of romantic past. So of all this, Baudrillard kind of proposes an interestingly, it's kind of surprisingly pragmatic way to reevaluate how we conduct our lives. So he says that suppose that all the major diacritical oppositions with which we order our world were traversed by seduction, instead of being based on contrasts and oppositions. Suppose not just that the feminine seduces the masculine, but that absence seduces presence, cold seduces hot, the subject seduces the object, and to be sure, the reverse. For seduction supposes that minimum reversibility, which puts an end to every fixed position, and, therefore, every conventional semiology, towards an inverted semiology. So, again, this idea of reversibility permeates. This idea of reversibility is part and parcel with seduction. It's difficult to say if the two can be separated, but they are there. They are intertwined, they're intermeshed, they define each other in many ways. Baudrillard goes on to conclude this book, or work towards the conclusion, by considering the distinction between rule and law. So, quite simply, rule corresponds to a game, while the law corresponds to society, to constitution, to regulation, anything like that. So then the rule, I guess in a sense, corresponds to the realm of signification, corresponds to the realm of seduction, to the secret in a sense, whereas the law is that which, works within political economy. The law is that which, is true. The law is that which is unchanging. Anything of that sort. So he's using these terms kind of loosely, metaphorically. So he states that ordinarily we live within the realm of the law, even when fantasizing about its abolition. So then he goes on to clarify that it is not the absence of law, that stands opposed to the law. Rather, it is the rule that stands opposed to the law. So Baudrillard goes on. The rule plays on an immanent sequence of arbitrary signs, while the law is based on a transcendent sequence of necessary signs. So I think we would do well to just think about this in pretty simple terms. Think about a board game compared to, federal law or something like that. Like, a rule in a game would be that you move your piece according to the number that appears on the die. Whereas, let's just take that as being one possible rule, and then in the realm of law, you can't drive your car over a certain speed limit. So in both of these instances, there are consequences, in a sense, there are certain limitations placed on the person's ability, or the ability to transgress said limits. We all speed in our cars. If, thinking about how fast you're supposed to go on the highway, whether it's, 60, 65 miles an hour or 100 kilometers an hour or whatever, few people, I say majority of the people are above that, so are in a sense breaking the law. There is little consequence for that though, until you go past a certain threshold. And then the consequences become very real, and they match something in the ideal situation, right? If we take a minute and we kind of forget about how certain people get pulled over a lot more than others, and we just think about it as a kind of, idealistic thing, then we have established not only a limit, but we have established a certain set of disciplinary sanctions that will fall upon the person that transgresses that limit. Whereas in the rule, there is no such thing. Even the breaking of a rule, the consequences that come from that are open to discussion. The consequences that come from that do not omit the person who committed said infraction, does not omit their voice from it. I think of just breaking a rule in a board game, for instance, and let's assume that it was by accident, right? Whereas in the case of the law, let's say it was by accident too. People, you're on the highway for 5 or 6 hours, like you sometimes forget how fast you're going, you don't mean to, yet the law remains the same. Whereas in the rule, in the board game, if you disturb the rule and it changes the course of the game in some way or other, or it has affected the course of the game, then you must discuss how you will overcome that. Does the game cease altogether? Do you accommodate said transgression of the rule? Do you continue as though nothing happened? So it's that kind of malleability that interests Baudrillard, and it's in that way that he places it in opposition to the law. But Baudrillard takes this idea a little bit further, and he says that because of the absence of a sort of repression with the rule, no one disagrees, ideally, on what the rules are, because you enter into that game knowing what the rules are. It's laid out for you in advance. You don't come in and then discuss what the rules will be. They are there. And they aren't really up for debate. But it is in that way that how it in itself kind of ironically occupies that kind of transcendent space that people refuse in many cases to transgress, to kind of subordinate, to subvert said rule or any given rules. Because for Baudrillard, he thinks that this is the remnant of a time long gone. That really speaks to our, what I'll call reluctantly human nature. But it is something for that reason that we really feel discomfort with upsetting. Which is, you easily poke holes in such an argument. Like, I break rules all the time. You ever play pool at a bar? If you ever get the chance to throw balls in when they aren't looking, like, we all do this kind of thing. Yet, again, we kind of have to take his word in these kind of ideal circumstances. So it is the game, it is the rule that has some kind of an affinity with ritual, with ceremony, with sacrifice, with all these things that that existed in the past, that Baudrillard is trying to, in a sense, locate the remnants of, or kind of sift through the ruins of our current post-historical society. So he calls on us to understand that one must rid oneself of the idea that all happiness derives from nature and all pleasure from the satisfaction of desire. On the contrary, games, the sphere of play, reveal a passion for rules, a giddiness born of rules, and a force that comes from ceremony. Jesus, that was the cat. Scared the shit out of me. A giddiness born of rules, and a force that comes from ceremony and not desire. So we see here the foundations of what will be in his later work be called singularity. So the kind of perfection of any given system, but a perfection that is that people are happy with, in a sense, if such a thing could ever exist, where it demands almost like a pre-conscious state of the human, where you don't have that ability to kind of evaluate your surroundings and say, hey, this doesn't seem right, or something like that. It kind of demands a passivity, like a general apathy to any possibility of there being something wrong occurring, which has some fascist implications. There's no denying that, but in some ways it does have some very, liberal sentiments, thinking about how difference or whatever can in itself be, a whole point of designation, or a whole without it necessarily coming into contact with otherness. Which is interesting because, we think that the West in very many ways, especially in North America where I'm doing this from, we have a profound desire to take things from other cultures. We take yoga from here, and then we take hummus from here, we take our fucking quinoa from over there. We go around and we can do that, and we can, like a pick and mix toolbox of anything we want. Nothing's off limits. Now this is what stands radically opposed to the rule or singularity for Baudrillard, because it doesn't show there to be a limit. in the realm of the game, there is that element of chance that Baudrillard does not really see existing in terms of the law. So he states that the consummate vertigo induced by a game, when the throw of the dice ends up eliminating chance, ironically, when, for example, the same number appears against all odds several times in a row, a game's ultimate fantasy, the ecstasy of checking chance, when, in the grip of a challenge, the same throw is repeated, the prisoner of a recurring series, and as a result the law and the chance are abolished, just because they are, I guess in a sense, made a mockery of themselves, which is where the radicality of the game as opposed to the law, or the rule opposed to the law, lies for Baudrillard. One of its constitutive components, notably chance, in the game, we think of gambling, for instance, can very easily be overturned, which is necessary, and it logically follows from his thesis of seduction. It would be erroneous to attach to any characteristic of, a seductive enterprise, a sort of finality or a determinacy that doesn't allow it to change. Everything must be susceptible to that very change in a form of reversibility, where chance, in a sense, becomes order. Like the example of, throwing snake eyes 25 times in a row. Then it's just absurd. Like, then you are no longer dealing with the realm of chance, but fate, in a sense. Which is, or destiny, even better, and how that is always lurking in the shadows for Baudrillard, how it's always prepared to come forward, make itself known, to kind of wrest us, even in the seductive encounter, away from, I guess, total indeterminacy or whatever, to make us aware of how things can easily fall into place, and by that very token, or by that very logic, throw us off, in a sense. Order as a component of disorder, or as that which leads into disorder, precisely because if we have become accustomed to disorder or chance. But with all this talk of games and society or law and rule, Baudrillard goes so far to say that even as I just mentioned about the role of order in seduction, in a sense, and how order can be part of that encounter, Baudrillard suggests that precisely because of that, in a sense, the oppressive mechanisms have taken hold and founded a new model to permeate today. And for him, it takes the form of the norm. So the norm for how it goes for Baudrillard is that we're no longer living in an era of rules and rituals. We are no longer living in an era of laws and contracts. We live today according to norms and models. So here we're hearing the echoes of his earlier work, in the system of objects. And we do not even have a term to designate that which is replacing sociality and the social. So to jump back a little bit, for him, the rule corresponds to, as he lays out here, rituality, the law to sociality, society. The norm, however, does not correspond to anything at all. We might say, looking ahead a little bit to the masses or the silent majorities, how that is part and parcel with the norm. How a certain silence, a certain closed offness, does play that role, kind of Fahrenheit 451 like. So for him, we are presently living within a minimum of real sociality and a maximum of simulation. Simulation neutralizes the poles that organize the perspectival space of the real and the law, while draining off the energy potential that still drives the space of the law and the social. So any of the remnants of the law, or of the social, of the real, we think of libidinal drives, production, anything like that, then comes to occupy a place that was once held by the ritual, where chants seep through, seduction seep through, mystery seep through, and now these things seep through. Like in the case of pornography, for instance, where people allocate time and energy to think about how pornography might serve some kind of libidinal function or some kind of like libidinal drive or desire. Certain scientific discourses that go off about such things, as though these simulated instances can be thought of seriously in that capacity. And it's kind of the discourse going on around that kind of stuff is really troubling at times. Either the total disavowal or slut shaming that goes on. Like we've really entered a shitty space and time. So for him, however, he doesn't attach to it a certain meaning, as I just did, thinking about silence in a sense. But he does ascribe to it the designation of digitality, which I think is fair. The distinction between, myself and a computer or my cell phone or whatever, throws a wedge in what would have been constituted a certain sociality at a certain time. We can think of Hannah Arendt here, for instance, what comes after the social, if you will. She was thinking of the social as being a contemporary or modern phenomenon. What comes after. Baudrillard really does fill in. There are some great affinities between Baudrillard and Arendt. Arendt was very much a thinker, a modernist thinker, very much privileging certain ideas of the past, especially the Greeks, which are things that Baudrillard would have a little bit more trouble with, but really theorizing the effects of like technology on this thing called the human condition. These thinkers go really well together. There's a good essay to be written. I've already done it a few times in different ways, but I'm sure someone can do it a lot better than me. So everywhere, though, we are surrounded with remnants, or perhaps compensatory methods by which we can convince ourselves, or through which we can convince ourselves that we haven't lost this. We haven't lost that sociality, which was in itself already something of a removal. Kind of, this Platonic reasoning, as Plato thinks about simulation in the Republic. We are moving in degrees away from something that may have come first, perhaps. But Baudrillard states that, for example, the news has been invaded by this phantom content, this homeopathic transplant, this waking dream of communication, a circular construction where one presents the audience with what it wants, an integrated circuit of perpetual solicitation, so that convincing oneself of there being that communication, where, and I can't remember where, and I think I may have mentioned it here on one of these episodes here already, what Baudrillard has to say about a television set being left on in an empty room. It really reveals how indifferent the television is to us. The television will speak to no one. It does not care. Whereas, you have a book. A book is not presenting itself to anyone unless it is being read. Whereas a television is very loud in its communication. It's compensating for something that I believe is fundamentally something that we've lost. Communication. Not to say it can never be regained. I think such an idea is dangerous. Or that it ever really existed. But the idea of it has existed. And I believe that is enough to, force us in many ways to, exert such a great deal of effort in consolidating it once again. Same would apply, I believe, to that thing called the unconscious, or these, unchanging universal sexual drives in how they come out in pornography, for instance, as though these things can ever be said to have existed. In fact, our becoming aware of them existing, we think of Foucault's second volume to the History of Sexuality, was only a condition of their being repressed. in a sense, thinking back to the Greeks. And because of that, in a sense, our kind of management of ourselves turned us into subjects or individuals or whatever, having control over ourselves, and therefore demanded first and foremost that a repression of that. So I believe that Baudrillard only affirms this position when he, or my idea here, when he says that the extreme form of this process is to be found in our contemporary mass media, where there never was an original, things being conceived from the start in terms of their unlimited reproducibility. So he brings this up in conjunction with him thinking about cloning. Now cloning is in a sense that serves a similar function, where cloning is therefore to Baudrillard, the ultimate state of the body's simulation, where the individual, reduced to an abstract genetic formula, is destined to serial multiplication. Then he thinks about Benjamin in relation to that in the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction, and what happens to a thing's aura. I think ultimately for Baudrillard, like I would think about Arendt, such a thing like an aura would be a little bit absurd. But here we have it, nevertheless. So we're caught now in an age of obscenity. Obscenity being another key term in Baudrillard's work that he lays out more clearly in Fatal Strategies. But the obscenity being a thing brought to its total realization. A thing made more than what it can be, in a sense, continually circumventing its own limits, transgressing them, setting new limits, really becoming a caricature of itself. Kind of the realization of the Thousand Plateaus dream. The constant drive forward, right? Where every plateau is surpassed. Which, if we think of things as really being made of assemblages, kind of in the rhizomatic sense, then all things are in themselves a sort of singularity. And by that very token, can then be subject to that same argument. Where for Baudrillard, he doesn't want to think of seduction as being something that can be mobilized. He doesn't want to see seduction as being something that can be taken as a political tool. Because for him, seduction does not work in accordance with contemporary politics precisely because it far precedes that, and it just doesn't fit. No, Baudrillard, and it's a little conservative in this way, but at the same time, kind of radical. It's really confusing. Like, I have a lot of trouble with it. I hope that other people will tell me why I'm stupid in what I've said. But I think it's important to note that Baudrillard does not advocate for the kind of Deleuzian, rhizomatic form of becoming, because for him that would feed too much into a system. That would have too much faith in the individual's ability to navigate this system. Whereas for Baudrillard, he wants to see things change, because that is one of the properties of seduction, or having things be wrested from their place, from the determinacy. But at the same time, it's not something that we can ever really be aware of. It's just something that occurs, kind of like a historical movement or whatever. Kind of like a little dialectical in that way. Or is it Badiou? I think, you don't know a revolution is ever happening, right? You can only look back and say, wow, look at that. And then you lay out all its effects, whatever. That really, I think, captures what Baudrillard wants seduction to look like, or what he thinks it looks like. But on that note, there's a lot here. There's a lot I didn't cover, a lot of specific stuff that Baudrillard brings up about Kierkegaard, about Balth, that, I really hope everyone interested in this will actually go and read it, and to really take what I say. Like, I've read this, I don't even know how many times I've read this, and it gets more confusing every time. And with every one of these kind of talks I've done, I've really questioned my knowledge of this subject matter, because I end up bringing more questions to the table than answers, which is the real task of philosophy. So maybe I'm not off track. But anyways, for anyone who listened this far, thank you. I hope you can get something out of this, even if it's something small. But you will never get as much out of this as you will from the book itself. So go and buy it. Go and find it in the library or something. Read it and let it blow your mind, or throw it at a wall. Anyways.